We are here today because we want to learn about how to maximize the chances of recovering erectile function after prostate cancer surgery in particular. Now, this is a very important subject because I've seen hundreds of men now and their partners who are post prostate cancer surgery, and I hear the same question over and over again, which is, when will the erections return? Hello, Anonymous. When will the erections return? Now, the fact that this is the question I'm asked in almost every single appointment just shows this is important. You know, of course, I speak about sexuality very holistically. We talk about what sex is because that's different to every single person. However, I think this comes back to, say, you woke up after surgery and your arm wasn't moving or working. Of course, at some point you want to have conversations about how you can still cook and clean and do tennis, the things that you love to do, but you also want to know, hey, what's going on with my arm? What can we do for rehab to make sure that this is in really good condition? How can we get that back? So that's where the focus of the talk is going to be today. And it's also important because mostly what I hear from people is they may have been recommended some pills, they may have been recommended injections, but I think what's important is that we understand the framework and the bigger picture of why these are being suggested so that you yourself can decide what makes sense for you in your own recovery journey. Now, a disclaimer at this point. My general disclaimer, of course, is this is general information. Please always seek medical advice, your urologist, your GP, especially when it comes to the pills and injections side of things. But the other disclaimer I want to make clear is that everyone is completely different when it comes to their sexual recovery and erection recovery journey. Just because something happened to one person doesn't mean that that will be your journey as well. As we're about to discuss, even the erection, as well as sex as a whole, has so many components as part of it that it's very difficult to actually put an estimate on what your recovery will be. And what I instead will describe to you is this idea of, let's approach this as maximizing your chances and creating the best, most positive conditions to get the goals that are important to you. So that's my intention today, that hopefully you'll leave with this framework and with options of what you can do to plan your own recovery and hopefully give you some confidence and hopefully a bit of relief as well, because you know what's going on. So let's talk about this approach that I've just mentioned before. Now, when a lot of people come to see me, often the kind of questions that I can hear underlying our conversation are along the lines of, how do I speed up nerve recovery? Now, instead, I'd encourage you to take on a different kind of approach, an approach I think is a bit more helpful for this particular kind of sexual recovery, and that is one of general erection health, creating the best possible conditions for any spontaneous erection to occur. Now, I'm going to tell you a story that really helped me in my own mind kind of click this together. Earlier this year in February, I had the absolute pleasure of being able to have dinner with John Mulhall. So John Mulhall is probably the #1 penile rehabilitation, I'd say, cheerleader. He is really pro people doing rehabilitation, especially after prostate cancer surgery. I got to sit down with him and we were both talking at a conference in February with a notepad, a good glass of wine, and just kept saying to him, listen, the question I'm asked over and over is, when will the nerves recover? Please, what is your answer? And what he said to me was, well, we know that the process of nerve recovery for the cavernous nerves, which are the ones surrounding the prostate that I'm sure you've heard about over and over again, can take a full 2 years. It can take up to that time for nerve recovery. It can be different for some people, but what we believe is that it's 2 years. Now, this is interesting because I've read studies and I've seen people as well, seen case studies of people who had nothing up to 2 years, but then something started to occur between 2 to 4 years. And in fact, the literature says the clinical recommendation at the moment is to recommend expecting 2 to 4 years. And what he said to that was, well, there's also, of course, a psychological influence, and there's also a cardiovascular influence within erection recovery. Now, say at 2 years, the person who has been trying their hardest to rehabilitate themselves during this time just has a huge sense of relief and almost stress reduction of, well, maybe it's not going to happen. Perhaps it's the stress reduction that then helps the erection essentially almost begin again. This was fascinating. It really got my head around this idea that while we're so focused on talking about the interaction of nerves and erection when it comes to prostate cancer surgery and erectile recovery, we must remember that the erection is a lot more holistic than this. So many different, I'd say, moving parts. There's going to be a lot of accidental puns here. Moving parts play a part in the bigger picture. Now, here's a little something I prepared earlier to talk us through this in more detail. So, can everybody see this and read this? I want to make sure it's coming across clearly on screen. If it's not, I'll just do all sorts of gestures. I see the chat box has been quiet for a while. Is everybody hearing me loud and clear? I think there's a bit of delay here, so I'll just keep on going and hopefully it's coming across okay. So yes, we've got a yes. We'll keep going. Fantastic. So here is the erection recipe, as I would call it. If we were going to create a spontaneous erection from a piece of paper, these are our main components to think about. Up top here, blood flow. An erection is a hydraulic event. It's blood flowing in and then being encapsulated and then flowing out again. So blood flow is extremely important. Blood flow including really healthy veins, arteries, and a cardiovascular system. The actual tissue, and tissue is quite general here. I'm speaking about the smooth muscle tissue in the penis that, of course, requires that blood flow and oxygenated blood just to keep it going, like any other part of the body. But, of course, being a smooth muscle tissue rather than, say, skeletal muscle, it's even more imperative that activity is used within the tissue to keep it in top condition. Otherwise, if it's left inactive, atrophy can occur. We'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. Arousal. So when I talk to people about this idea of an erection, where does it actually begin? Because, of course, when it begins, it's sort of like the whole orchestra coming in at once when you're having a spontaneous erection. After prostate cancer surgery, of course, and from this is what clients have told me as well, it's you're in this bizarre state where all the components are essentially placed apart. You know, you get to even experience this wonder and bizarreness that you can have an orgasm without ejaculation and without erection. It's on a completely different nervous system. And again, the nervous system the erection sits on is the parasympathetic nervous system. And this requires a state of immediate arousal in order to move yourself into that system, and also requires a low stress environment. So remember, the erection begins up here. An arousal created through physical stimulation, through visible, through audible. Many people are aroused in different ways. And finally, what we've talked about, and you've probably heard enough of by this point, are the nerves, the cavernous nerves. So this is our full erection recipe. What has changed precisely after prostate cancer surgery? If you were experiencing spontaneous erections pre-surgery, the major change is these nerves are asleep. They are in a state of what we basically call trauma. And of course, their damage will actually be different from person to person. And again, let's talk about what we can control. You can't necessarily control what's happened to your nerves at this point after you've had surgery. What we can think about are all of the rest above this. Now, something that I think is truly, truly important that we maybe don't talk about enough is the fact that when the cavernous nerves are traumatized and they're in a state of basically trauma blanket and they're just looking to be left alone, what's also going on is you're not having nocturnal erections. Now, anybody who's listening to this, who's had surgery is going, yes, love, I know all about this, it's not happening. And that also can be very distressing. We don't talk about that enough. Something that you may have experienced every morning is no longer there to greet you in the morning, to say hello while you're making that first cup of tea of the day. Now, this is because the cavernous nerves, when the parasympathetic nervous system is enacted during a deep sleep cycle, the cavern essentially sends a phone call, shoots down the spinal cord to the nerves release nitric oxide, creates an erection. When the nerves are off, that also means you are no longer getting erections at night. Now, this is why we believe this is a very crucial, important point, and it's sort of the underpinning almost of all erection rehabilitation. I'm going to explain it with an analogy. So while we don't know exactly why people have nocturnal erections, and I say people because men and women have them too. The clitoris is erectile tissue and it also becomes engorged and erect at night, 3 to 5 times for both men and women. But when that is not happening, think of it like a rubber band. We believe that nocturnal erections are potentially the body's way of essentially taking the penis for a jog at night, or the clitoris, keeps the erectile tissue in top condition like a jog around the park would. So say it's a rubber band, and it's just being stretched just gently every day, just a gentle stretch. Now, Say when the cavernous nerves are inact, and that means there are no nocturnal erections, the rubber band is still, or it's just not being used. Now, say a few months go past or a year goes past. With a rubber band, when you then go to stretch it, it's unlikely to be as supple, as easy to stretch. And the whole idea, essentially, of this whole idea of if you don't use it, you lose it. Honestly, Fiona, thanks, that's very lovely of you to say. Quick side note, Fiona on the chat box is finding this awesome. That's lovely to hear, thank you. A quick note, so back to the rubber band. When it's being stretched regularly, it's essentially keeping everything supple and just keeping things moving and working. So when you think of erection rehabilitation, keep in mind, it's anything that's essentially keeping these two things going. You're continuously moving blood into the tissue and keeping the tissue in as good condition as possible. So 3 strategies in order to keep these two going, essentially manually taking yourself for that jog every day because it's not happening at night. Move this over. 3 main strategies. There are pills, there are injections, and there is what we colloquially will call the pump, but the very clinical term is vacuum erection device. Now, I'm saying very colloquial language here just to keep it real. I'm sure your doctors already talked you through the idea of pills, Viagra, Cialis. These are the 2 common names that might have been mentioned to you. Now, what is the logic behind Viagra and Cialis when you no longer have your nerves awake? A lot of clients who come to me, they will say one of the first things as, I can no longer get an erection and the Viagra isn't working. Now, this is, I think, a horribly disappointing thing to go through. If you prescribe Viagra and you take it and think like the adverts, it's just going to pop right up, and that's what you're expecting. Please know that almost everyone I see after surgery, especially immediately afterwards, will have no actual erection effect from taking Viagra. And this is why. When the phone call is made from arousal in the mind, right down the spine to the cavernous nerves in order to fire that nitric oxide, it's the nitric oxide, the chemical messenger to start the erection, that the Viagra and Cialis essentially talk to. They talk to it and it just speeds it up. It makes this sort of whiz-bang erection, but it doesn't happen immediately as well. And it requires, of course, that nerve to be turned on. Now, when, say, a urologist has said to you, well, you might want to take a little bit of Viagra Cialis every day, the logic there is instead of it being to actually create an erection, it's actually this idea of keeping sort of the background tissue, the endothelium layer in particular, which we think of as being the living walls, essentially, of the penis. This is back to the idea of really good blood flow with a really good erectile tissue. The belief is, and this is John Mulhall's work, and he has a book called Saving Your Sex Life that will talk you more broadly through this, and these are the kind of links I'll be providing in the email with this recording afterwards. The belief is that this keeps the endothelium layer in really top condition. So it's more like, if you're prescribed in that way, like a background multivitamin for your penis. You don't expect at a low dose for it to actually create an erection. Now, say you have been prescribed by a urologist to just take 1 whole pill every so often. The idea here is that the pill is we're looking to see whether the nerves have woken up at all. Because if the nerves have woken up, and even if a little bit of nitric oxide is released, the Viagra will essentially encourage that along, create more of an erection. And notice I'm saying more, or a degree of. It's very unlikely that you have no erections and then suddenly overnight it's back on. Any kind of progress, even if it's a feeling of a tingle, a little bit of engorgement, is to be celebrated. That's part of the journey. The journey looks a lot more like this than like this. So that's the idea behind the pills that you may be prescribed upon the journey. What's the idea of an injection? So the injection actually bypasses the nerves and also even bypasses arousal. So Viagra or Cialis rely on arousal to send the signal and rely on the nerves then to be awake to send the nitric oxide out. However, injections go straight into the side of the penis, and I want you to know, if your eyes are wide thinking injections in my penis, you can't be serious, then most people have this, almost everyone I think has this at first. They see an injection therapist who's probably a nurse practitioner specializing in how to give and teach erection therapy, and everyone tends to come out the other side saying, wow, that was not as bad as I thought it would be. There's in fact auto injectors like they do give to diabetics that can make the whole experience a lot easier. So the injection goes into the penis and this bypasses, so this will create an erection without needing actually arousal or the nerves to be awake. Now, the logic behind why you might go for an injection, say, why you might try an injection, is the injection will essentially work with arterial blood as well as venous blood. So the penis has veins as well as deep interior arteries. Now, anyone out there who's tried a pump and has also tried injections probably has noticed there's a difference between the erection created with both. This is because injections, more arterial oxygenated blood flowing in right down the center, and with the pump, it's going to be more venous blood, so you probably get more of an engorgement with a pump, but you'll get an injection that's more like what you were used to pre-surgery with injections. That's something to keep in mind. With all of this, my recommendation is when you're thinking of what you can bring into your erection rehab plan, just experiment with actually all of them. Cobble them together. You can use a pump, for example, with injections. You can use a pump with the Viagra Cialis just to bring a little bit more blood in. And it's also part of this exploration and curiosity as a mindset I encourage you to put into the whole process. And so finally, the pump or the vacuum erection device. Now, the vacuum erection device that I recommend is this one here. This is the VacuRect. I recommend it because it's simple enough to be used every single day, 5 to 10 minutes a day for rehabilitation. How does it work in rehab? So this in particular can help you with avoiding shrinkage or even bringing length back after surgery. Now, I met up at the weekend with a wonderful person who's become a good friend, luckily. His name is Alan, and he has written a fantastic book called We've Lost My Prostate Mate and Life Goes On. I'll send you a link to that after this video. The story he told me that really resonated, because I've heard it from clients too, is that the actual, the condition of the length lost from the penis after surgery is one of the least talked about elements of sexual function change after prostatectomy. He was giving a talk recently, and a man actually stood up in the audience, raised his hand while Alan was talking about erectile dysfunction, and made it very clear that this was an element he was not told about, and it had affected him significantly. And I think it's something we need to talk about more. The research actually shows that only about 23% of men currently are being told that they may lose length to the penis after surgery. And the funniest thing is, I actually have a broken ruler that I found on the floor recently that has about the amount, if we put it here, that could be lost after surgery. So we believe it's about 2 to 3 centimeters, and I had a really interesting phone conversation last week with Dr. Stephen Adams, who's a sexual dysfunction specialist over in Perth, Western Australia. And he also agreed, yes, so many men go through this and we're not talking about it. And he also believes that using a vacuum erection device every day is a really good strategy in order to help bring back what has been lost and just to avoid further shrinkage as well. So that's why I highly recommend this device here. Now, here are your 3 strategies, and that's how an erection works. Please, in the window, start to post questions or any comments, or if any of this is resonating with you, you need some more clarity, please bring that in. I'm going to address some of the questions you may have on your mind right now. You weren't told about it, Peter. Yes, thank you so much for sharing that. And yes, it did affect you. And I think we need to talk about this more. You know, we need to have frank conversation, a normalized conversation. It's just another part of the body. Say you went through surgery and another muscle of your body changed, we would talk about that too. To encourage, what about 3 times per week if getting nothing to encourage? Yeah, thank you so much for the question, Alex. So Alex, could you clarify, is that 3 times per week to use particularly injections or pills or a pump? Very good question. How soon after surgery can you start with the pump? So we have literature that has shown men can start with the pump actually as soon as, we'd recommend probably as soon as the catheter is removed. You can use it while you're still incontinent, but of course take it at your own pace. This comes back to everyone is different. Now, your body's in recovery. If you are feeling pain and a lot of discomfort and you have very low energy, please just take time to take care of yourself. Leaving this, 1 or 2 months probably is not going to have a drastic effect. What we're saying with rehabilitation is do not be leaving this maybe a year or 2 years. And we have another couple of comments coming in. Coming in for Alan, still needs stimulation with pills to assist arousal. Yes, thank you so much for that comment. So I want to make that very clear. The need for stimulation, especially I think more physical stimulation, because we do not have the erection that probably didn't need as much physical before, may need more now in order to assist arousal when you're using Viagra or Cialis. When you take Viagra or Cialis, make sure you are feeling low stressed, you're not rushed. Take some time to explore physical arousal, either alone or with your partner. Taking it and just expecting it to work can only, unfortunately, lead to disappointment. We have another comment here coming in that the Vacurect was the easiest one that they tried because it's smaller, yes, and can be used under the sheets while you have a morning cup of tea. Thank you so much for that comment. So the Vacurect here, and I want to say now I am offering the Vacurect through my website, and for the next 2 weeks it will have a 4-week free program attached to it, which is an email-based training course to make sure that you as well can get the best results out of this. And a few reasons that it is easy, as this wonderful person has mentioned, that it's a lot smaller. So that's going to reduce the likelihood of testicles being sucked into the device. It's a genuine thing. We've got to talk about it or else you may not know. And that's not a good surprise that you want. And that it also can be used easily every day, even under the sheets, even while you're making a cup of tea. Something that's easy to bring into your routine. So we are asking, quite a lot. This is quite a substantial change, is to think, how can I bring daily rehabilitation into my life that is to do with sexuality? Some people find it hard to find time to even exercise. How are you going to do this? And I recommend finding points in your routine and ways you can bring something in, even if it's just 10 minutes a day, even if it's 5 minutes a day. So you can use something like a vacuum erection device, for example, in the shower when you've already got vasodilation from the warm water, just to keep things ticking along. Another idea that I actually got from Dr. Stevens, I talked to him this week when he's over in Perth, was the idea of having maybe injection Sundays. So, for example, we are working. So, for example, on a Sunday, have an injection Sunday. Decide when I go and make my cup of tea, I'm going to use an injection and then come back to bed. Now, if you both feel like it, you could use the erection for pleasure. Otherwise, you know that you've done some rehabilitation that week. So something I think that's important, I mentioned I'd be addressing, is that this does not have to be clinical. Bringing a clinic into your bedroom with all of this, nothing is going to be potentially arousing about that. Of course, each to their own, but most people say rather keep all this clinical stuff away from that. And a way you can do that is to think through strategies such as injecting over a cup of tea on a Sunday, bringing that into bed. Another idea could be just to keep the two separate, keep rehabilitation separate from pleasure. So deciding when I'm alone, that's rehabilitation, but when I'm with my partner, we'll just keep that as a sexual space. And if we use one of these ideas together, talk about it before, how can you make it fun? You could even introduce an idea such as a loving assist, where as you're pumping, your partner caresses you, or you could also do the same back when they are masturbating as well. And masturbation is not something, honestly, we're talking about enough in this area. It is part of rehabilitation. It's part of creating arousal. It's part of bringing sensation and pleasure back into your body when such a significant change has occurred. Now, I have just gone off on one for a while, so let's return to the questions because I see they're coming in. I'm going to scroll down a bit here. So we have here, whoop. Yes, daily. Thank you, Alex. Daily can indeed be hard to maintain using the pump. That's why I recommend going for something that's the easiest possible option. So this is just a two-step technique. You'd apply an opening, you'd apply water-based lubricant, and then the motion is an up-down action. So what I said, the very intuitive action, just an up-down, and then when you create the erection, you simply take it off the device. So super simple, no attachments, something as well, it's pretty innocuous. This isn't like the Austin Powers, it's not mine, baby, it's not mine model. That's such an unfortunate thing to be in the media. But remember, this is a medical device, it's for rehab. That's not the same category as what's going on there. And another question coming in, man complaining of increased incontinence after pump for an hour at 6 months post-surgery. Any ideas? Yeah, it's a great question. So, and this is after they've used a pump. That's unfortunate, I can't get a total clarification. So I have got clients who have actually gone both ways on this, where they've said actually using the pump has helped with incontinence. I just feel any exercise and any focus is great for the whole pelvic floor as well as the penile muscle as well. If you are finding that using the pump, however, you feel is increasing incontinence, or you feel you're leaking a lot into the pump, some strategies to try would be to make sure that your bladder is completely empty before you try pumping, but also to know, look, there's no damage, there's no harm in using this when you do have incontinence. If you are feeling like, I think that this is affecting my incontinence, I would then just do an experiment, pause on using the pump for a while, see if things improve. Also, of course, talk to your pelvic floor physiotherapist. They are there to specifically help you with incontinence, and they're fabulous people. If you don't have one, I'd say it's an incredibly important part of any team. And Martin mentioned to keep the instructions to the vacuurected every few months. You need to dismantle the vacuurector a full clean and to relube it, which is very easy, but you need to know which way the seal goes. So with any vacuum erection device that you buy, there will be a period of adjustment where you get used to the technique. And as Martin says, look, down the line, you may want to maintain, or you probably will want to maintain this as well. And that's why today I'm selling this in the link that's down below with the 4-week training course, which will talk you through all of that, full guidance to make sure you get the most out of the device. Yes, Martin agrees. Cialis, you absolutely need it with Cialis, you absolutely need to be aroused as well if you want this to work at all. Can you combine injections with pills? It's not recommended to do so, I believe. So leave always 48 hours between using pills with injections. Consider this a pharmaceutical question, medical disclaimer time. Please make sure that you ask your urologist and you see particularly an injection therapist when you're going through the injection process. This is the kind of great question that they can clarify you on, but I do believe indeed, yes, you must keep them separate from each other. And Martin mentions as well how important lubrication is, and that's quite right, Martin, thank you for mentioning it. Now, lubrication in a few ways is important. If you're using a vacuum erection device, you want to make sure to create a really, really good seal that you have a lot of water-based lubricant. Most people, I find, the reason it's not working is they're just simply not using enough lube to make that good seal. And then other top tips to make the device actually more enjoyable is to as well cover the shaft with a really good feeling lubricant, maybe even a silicone and water-based combination lubricant, or even a silicone-based lubricant. Uberlube as a lubricant works actually well with this device, and it doesn't damage the silicone that's on the opening of the vacuurect. So that's a really good point, Martin. Now let's look at this one here. Thanks for bearing with me there. Are these methods purely for erections, or can any also help increase sensation that is reduced post-surgery? That is such a fantastic question. Thank you so much for asking it. So I actually had a couple of questions that came through that I collected before we went on with this webinar. And a lot of them were about what can we do when actual sensation or the feeling of pleasure and the feeling of arousal in the body has changed. And it really frustrates me because I don't feel there is enough literature that's focusing on this experience, which so many people go through. And if you are going through this, where you feel it's not just the erection, all the sensation and the feeling of pleasure has changed, you're not alone. So many people are struggling with this, but I want you to know that orgasm, pleasure, erection, these are all on completely different nervous systems. So the pleasure that you feel externally around the penis can absolutely be worked on. And in fact, I would just recommend different kinds of exercises for this. I'd recommend spending time with your masturbation, becoming very mindful and present within your body. In fact, bringing in a mindfulness practice. Again, I'll send some links for this idea in the recording afterwards. Bringing in a mindfulness practice to reconnect your body to pleasure, I think is an extremely important part of this process. Let's go back to this. It's important for the erection anyway, working on staying really relaxed, being in that parasympathetic nervous system and being aroused and experiencing pleasure is still part of the erection, and it absolutely can be improved upon and be worked upon. I'd see it as slightly separate to erection in that it's just is about reconnecting with pleasure in your body. It's about the nerve, especially the nerves that are in the skin, external to the penis, connecting back with pleasurable sensation. And what I hear from so many clients is that masturbation, when you are not erect, you can have an orgasm, but when you're masturbating flaccid at first, it's extremely bizarre. It can actually be quite difficult. There's actually, if you think about it, there's just less there to essentially hold on to and use. And also your brain has over time become used to a particular way of experiencing pleasure and arousal leading to orgasm. So you are experiencing essentially almost a different habit sequence and routine from experiencing pleasure right up to orgasm and erection. So it's a very different playing field that you're in, and spending time with yourself and being mindful and tuning into what your body likes and moving towards that is an extremely important part of this process. And here we have a few more questions here. Ooh. So one from Jenny. My partner has tried a cheap vacuum device with my help, but we found it very difficult to use and not effective. Instructions with the pump were very confusing, so we both felt dejected after a few tries. Jenny, thank you so much for sharing your story. This is something where a lot of clients approach me after they've had this exact experience. It can be extremely frustrating, extremely, when you try any of these strategies and they do not work as you expected, or you don't have the right instructions. It is so important to think about bringing anything like this in as basically almost learning to ride a bicycle for the first time. It takes good instructions, it does take some time and perseverance. And the reason I particularly recommend the vacurector model, I will mention it again, I am sending this below with a 4-week instructional video, a mostly video guide that's email delivered, in order for you to get the most out of using a device, because I don't want anybody to go through this experience of spending money on a device and not coming with instructions, potentially even leading to pain or disappointment. I'm sorry you've had to go through that experience, I encourage you to still keep exploring, keep trying new methods and new ways, maybe even approaching it again, trying a few of these tips, trying some extra lubricant, and I'll also send across in this recording afterwards sort of top 10 tips just to get the most out of any vacuum erection device. I've had a question here, what about the surgically implanted pump? That's a very good question. So this, I believe, is referring to when a penile implant is actually surgically put into the body. Now, this is something to keep in mind, that there's oh, one second, I've lost the question. There we go. Yes, the surgically implanted pump. This is something to keep in mind, that there is always an option down the line, even if you're trying all the above and you're not experiencing the erection quality after a few years you're expecting, or you can decide to do this sort of when it suits you. Going for a surgical implant, it does require more surgery, and it can either be a hydraulic device or one that bends, where what I would suggest thinking about is talking to a urology nurse maybe who specializes in this, or a urologist as well who specializes in the implanting of these devices. Just keep in mind, once that's in, it is permanent, and it does need replacing after a number of years. So it's good to go in with a list of questions if this is an option you're going for down the line. Of course, at first, I would encourage you to just create as good an erection health as possible, the conditions to see what potential you have to regain some erection recovery. Go to some more questions now. I find climacturia a real problem. I'm 5 weeks post-op. Does this improve? Fantastic question. Now, to clarify, for those who may not be aware, climacturia is the experience of urinating when you are aroused or upon orgasm. And I want this person who's asked this to know, so many men experience this at some point during their journey. What the literature suggests is that with pelvic floor exercises, most of the time this experience indeed does improve. So do have hope, and 5 years post-op, 5 weeks post-op, it's very early days. You're probably experiencing quite a lot of changes that are likely to improve and change over time. The experience of climacturia, we find it tends to improve, as well as the experience of what your orgasm will feel like. At first, it's sometimes very difficult to reach orgasm, or it's quite dampened. However, it's almost like with practice over time, that tends to improve as well. And some more. This is wonderful. Thank you so much, all of you, for these questions. We have, sorry, struggling with the chat window a little bit here. Any use trying the pump 8 years after surgery, or is it just flogging a dead horse? Thank you for this question. Now, this reminds me as well, I had quite a number of questions come in through the questionnaire before the webinar that were along these lines of, I'm 10 years, some people are saying 6 years, 10 years after surgery, I wasn't given information at the beginning, what are the chances of me sort of having any kind of erection at this point in time? A bit of this idea of, am I flogging a dead horse? Is there ever too late? Now, what I would suggest to this is first ask yourself, what are you hoping for? Is it to have a complete spontaneous erection back, or is it to have erections occasionally? Because what I'm talking about here are ways of creating an erection, particularly injections and the vacuum erection device, which do not require your nerves to be online. So if you're 10 years down the line, you feel, I don't know if my nerves have indeed recovered, 2 things I would suggest: just experimenting absolutely with a vacuum erection device or injections to see what erection you can make manually first, how that feels for you. That may just be a wonderful experience to see that again after so much time. If you're using either, we just take it very slow and gently. If that tissue's been inactive for a while, just a little bit slower and more gradual. For example, if you hadn't been using your arm for a number of years, then when you first came back to it, you'd of course be slow and gentle and build up those exercises. And then say you're quite a few years down the line, some other strategies to think about are also actually getting back into physical exercise. Now, that sounds maybe a little bit basic, but it's actually a first-line intervention for erectile dysfunction in general. Men tend to have a degree of erectile dysfunction that's about 10% at 40 years old, and this might surprise some of you, but 80% at 70 years old. That's some degree of erectile dysfunction. This is in general across the population, regardless of prostate cancer surgery. And what we found from that literature is that a huge mediating factor in that is whether those men also exercised and did cardiovascular exercise in particular. And they found that that reduced the rate of erectile dysfunction by 80% across both groups. So bringing in physical exercise as well as these strategies that we've just talked about today and your approach is extremely important as well, and something of course to try. Even if you are 10 years down the line, you can always bring in more physical activity and see what that does. Sometimes as well, as I mentioned before, stress can play a bigger part than we realize. So there are a few things I would encourage you at any stage of your journey to keep tweaking and trying to see if they make a difference for you. And we have someone mentioning the loss of ejaculation. That's Peter. Thank you, Peter. The loss of ejaculation can be loss, both mental and physical. Thank you so much for highlighting this, Peter. And it's something I haven't mentioned, of course, is that when the prostate is removed, of course, ejaculation as well is no longer possible. And that this can be really quite shocking. It's a very hard thing to imagine what your life will be like when something has just worked in one way for your entire life, and also what this may have been tied to. And I think the process of asking yourself, what is sexuality to me now? What is my relationship with myself? What does this function mean to me? And that's a conversation I encourage you to have with your partner, even with yourself, your mind, with a professional. This is absolutely a phase of even grieving, realizing the loss that is there, realizing what these parts actually did mean to you. And this is an ongoing journey, and it affects everybody mentally as well as physically in lots of different ways. And if you're finding this difficult, you're not alone. I have to keep repeating that you are absolutely not alone in finding this to be a difficult journey. And I encourage you to keep exploring, stay curious, keep trying strategies, and even the approach of potentially talking to somebody very much around the actual psychological, the mental impact that this has had, as well as the physical impact as well. And we've had a comment from Fiona. If you have a partner, pleasure without the intention of erection can help to relax generally. Playful touching and kissing can really help. Thank you so much for that comment, Fiona. Completely agree with Fiona. In fact, let's just come right back to our recipe again and remind ourselves that we're up here talking about the physiological, down here we're talking about the nerves, but right here in the middle, this is a lot of the recipe is all around just relaxing. It's about stress reduction. It's about moving into that parasympathetic nervous system, which we know is enacted through also general physical touch, through massage. This releases oxytocin, can greatly reduce your stress levels. And just, I think as well, coming back to this idea of making sure the clinic doesn't become a part of your bedroom. having conversations about when something is rehabilitation versus when something is time that you're enjoying together. Because even that relaxing experience of just enjoying pleasure and exploring pleasure in different ways in the body that are outside of the erection in itself still also helps physical recovery. It's a very holistic picture that we're working with. So thank you so much for mentioning that, Fiona. And another comment here, someone's mentioned that Viagra doesn't work for me, it just makes me angry, maybe because it doesn't work. I can absolutely imagine that that would be a potential experience if you're taking something and you are expecting it to work, as the whole of the media tells us Viagra is going to work, and as your urologist may have indicated it will work, and for it not to work, you can imagine how deep-seated that anger could be and the frustration. And I think frustration is an adjective that I hear the most coming from clients. This can be a very frustrating journey, and it's why I encourage to move the approach from really the focus being on speeding up a recovery, moving the focus to erection health, remembering any time that you try Viagra, it is still for your health. It is still coating the endothelium cells with really good quality environment for you to have really just a good condition. Sort of thinking of tending to a garden. There's a lot you can't control the seeds, but tend to the garden. And anytime something doesn't work, remind yourself you're still doing this because you care about your sexuality, you care about your health and your body. And it may take some time to find exactly what works for you, but also to not disregard your experience probably is very, very frustrating. I can imagine that. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm sure a lot of people feel the same. I have another question from Jenny. How possible are return of erections after a wide nerve resection? So when the nerves are not spared. Jenny, this is such a fantastic question. This is something that I really believe we need to move the focus of research onto case studies of men who have not had nerve sparing, but do have some erectile function. And I say that because while it's not many, I've worked with men who have unilateral nerve sparing, so very few nerves spared, and they are regaining erectile function to some degree. Remember, it's unlikely you'll get exactly the erection you had pre-surgery, but you may get what you had as age dependent. But also, I've also met individuals who had absolutely no nerve sparing, but some of them are waking up with erections. They get an erection occasionally. There's clearly so much more to this bigger picture than we do not understand. This is a bigger picture than just nerve function. There's a lot more involved. So I'd always say, look, there's always hope, and it's always coming back to what are you hoping to achieve? Even if you have non-nerve sparing, it's more likely than not that you may not have erectile function as what you're used to, if at all. Keep in mind that there are still ways we had here of creating an erection from scratch for when you want it, that you can still enjoy it, and maintaining that erection health throughout to just give yourself those optimal conditions, the best potential possible of making the most of what's there, I think is still imperative and worth thinking about, no matter what you've gone through. Now, someone's asked, does nerve transplant surgery work? It's a really good question. That's actually something I'm looking to research with more research by interviewing more experts who are overseas and are involved with this type of surgery. I know in Australia, where I'm based, I don't know of any experts who are here, particularly in this area. I believe a lot of it's going on in the USA and it's all very trial phase. But what I want to do is to interview those people and probably do another webinar along the lines that will explain that in more detail. Thank you so much for that question. Is trimix intra-urethral gel a good idea? Thank you so much. That's a great question as well. So I haven't actually mentioned here the idea of the intra-urethral seeds or the gels that can be implanted into the urethra. Some of these are very popular in other countries. I know they're quite popular in Sweden. However, in Australia, I've heard very few urologists and urology nurses who are actually recommending this or even prescribing them. So I haven't mentioned them simply because in the context I'm based, I haven't got a lot of evidence on how they work or how effective they are. But thank you for that question. And again, that's something I'd like to go and research further with people overseas. That's such an interesting question. Someone's asked, do oxytocin nasal sprays help? Fantastic question. So oxytocin is really colloquially, we'd call it sort of the love hormone. It's the chemical in the body that's associated with sexual pleasure and associated with relaxation as well. I do not know of any study that has looked into that, and I'm evidence-based. I'd like to come back to the evidence. However, I could see how there may be something in it. I've seen some very fascinating psychological studies that use it to just help people when they're in actually a high arousal state to significantly calm down. So it'd be interesting to see in a sexual context how that works. Again, fantastic question. I'm going to go and research that further to see if anyone in this particular space has looked into it. But I mean, in general, I would recommend as well, look into the natural ways that we know oxytocin is released in the body. Cuddles, hugs, massage, really communication even. Something to think around when you're in a sexual situation is thinking to yourself, do I feel safe? How could I feel even safer in this environment right now? Safety produces relaxation, again, can kickstart that parasympathetic nervous system, oxytocin, all the chemicals and that conditions that we want. And safety may even be, right, I'm actually feeling like I have a to-do list on my mind. There's a couple of items that I want to do. Maybe getting those out the way before you're in a sexual context is a good idea. Or looking around and thinking, actually, if I shut that door and I locked it, I just feel a lot safer knowing that we're not going to be interrupted. These little tweaks can make a big difference to your sexual experience. And then also, as we've seen here, the erection potential. And someone's mentioned using Viagra and Cialis has given them some unpleasant side effects. Thank you so much for mentioning that. So Viagra and Cialis indeed can produce some side effects. You may actually have stomach discomfort. Some people find they get headaches, all sorts of things. Again, unfortunately, this is something that's going to be very individual. And I recommend trying Viagra as well as trying Cialis to see if there's a difference in side effects for you, and to remind you as well to always be in an aroused state when you're taking a whole pill rather than using it in the background. I've heard from clients sometimes this can help with those arousal symptoms. Now we're getting a lot more comments and questions coming in, which is fantastic. But something I'm aware of is that we've reached 6:45. And what I promised you is that this would be a 45-minute long webinar. What I'd love to talk to you about in the last 5 minutes is a little bit more around the vacuum erection device, which I am selling. Down below, this is fantastic for anyone who's listening who is interested in establishing that 10-minute daily exercise in order to make sure they avoid shrinkage and to maybe regain length even they've lost during surgery, something that increases the blood flow. And a reminder as well that this device can be used to create and also maintain an erection. And this can be done regardless of the condition of your nerves, whether they're awake, whether they're not. This can maintain the erection. It will be slightly different to what you had before, but I have a training series, a 4-week training series that comes with the device, is available for the next 2 weeks. It's valued at $99, but if you get it today or within the next 2 weeks, it's free when you purchase this device. And I can't recommend this enough. It's taken me a year of working with clients, sending them all kinds of pumps under the sun to see what genuinely fits best into their day for this to be generalized rehab, and also to create the best possible erection that can then be used in a pleasurable and a sexual context. So it's called the VacuRect, and it's down below in the link there.